The galaxy watched in silence as an alien princess rejected every powerful alliance offered to her and chose a human billionaire instead. But the greatest shock was not her choice. It was the moment the human refused the throne, questioned the cost of power, and forced two civilizations to reconsider what true leadership meant. Welcome to Galactic Contact. We hope you enjoy today's story and have a wonderful day filled with happiness. Now, join us as we begin this unforgettable journey across the stars. The galaxy had prepared for a royal announcement. It had prepared for ancient families, military alliances, and carefully arranged promises between civilizations. It had prepared for Princess Valeara to choose the safest path for Eloria's future. It had not prepared for her to walk past every candidate, every ambassador, and every symbol of traditional power before stopping in front of a human from Earth. Alexander Reed, the man millions knew as a billionaire, the man few understood. The Grand Hall remained silent as the royal announcement system repeated his name. Every camera turned toward him. Every political observer waited for the same reaction. They expected confidence. They expected ambition. They expected him to step forward and accept the greatest position a human had ever been offered. Alexander looked at the throne. Then he looked at the thousands watching from the gallery. He did not move. "Before this decision becomes a celebration," he said, his voice carrying across the chamber, "there is something everyone should answer." The room changed instantly. Valeara watched him carefully. "What is your question?" she asked. Alexander looked toward the representatives of worlds that had built their civilizations around power, resources, and influence. Who carries the cost of this choice? The question unsettled the room more than any declaration could have. A human billionaire had been given access to a royal future, and his first concern was not what he would gain. It was who might lose. Alexander Reed had built one of the largest technology networks in human history. His companies created transport systems, medical platforms, and emergency infrastructure across multiple star systems. But wealth was not the reason Valeara chose him. She had studied his decisions long before this moment. She knew about the projects he canceled because they created dependence. She knew about the profits he rejected because the long-term consequences were worse than the short-term gains. The galaxy saw a powerful human. Valeara saw someone who understood that power without limits eventually became a burden carried by everyone else. "My choice is not an invitation for one person to rule another civilization," Valeara said. "It is a challenge for two civilizations to learn whether they can stand beside each other." The announcement ended without the victory celebration many expected. Instead, it created questions. Across the galaxy, governments analyzed the decision. Some saw opportunity. Others saw danger. Inside the Elorian Council, Lord Kalen Voss studied the report in silence. The older statesman had spent his life protecting Eloria's independence. He did not hate humans. He feared what happened when any civilization became too powerful to question. "A strong alliance can protect a civilization," he told the council. "But an unchecked alliance can slowly replace it." Later that evening, Alexander stood alone beside the palace observation window. Below him, millions of Elorian citizens moved through their daily lives, unaware that their future had just changed. Valeara approached without guards or ceremony. "You could have accepted the moment," she said. Alexander looked at the city. That moment belonged to everyone affected by it. She studied him. Most people would have seen the throne. He shook his head slightly. Most people only see what they are about to receive. For the first time that day, Valeara understood why her choice had shocked the galaxy. She had not chosen the human with the greatest influence. She had chosen the one person willing to question what influence was supposed to mean. The first question the Elorian Council asked Alexander Reed was not why he wanted power. It was why anyone should believe he would not use it. The request arrived less than a day after Princess Valeara's announcement. Officially, it was a standard review, politely worded, carefully prepared, but everyone understood the meaning behind it. Eloria was not rejecting the human. It was measuring the risk of allowing him closer to its future. Alexander entered the strategic oversight chamber without lawyers, corporate representatives, or political advisors. That decision alone created discussion among the council members. A man who controlled resources across multiple systems had arrived without anyone protecting his interests. Lord Kalen Voss stood at the center of the chamber, surrounded by centuries of recorded agreements between Eloria and other civilizations. Your companies operate medical networks, transportation systems, and energy platforms across dozens of worlds, Kalen said. Your influence exceeds that of many planetary governments. Alexander nodded. That is true. Several council members exchanged looks. They expected denial. They received acceptance. Kalen continued. And now you stand beside the future ruler of Eloria. Why should our people believe your influence will remain limited? Alexander looked at the data displays showing the reach of his companies. He did not answer immediately. They should not believe it because I say so. The chamber became quiet. Then what should they believe? Another council member asked. Alexander connected his personal archive to the chamber system. New files appeared. Independent oversight agreements. Shared ownership structures. Emergency systems controlled by multiple civilizations. Restrictions placed on his own corporations. They should believe the systems designed to function without me. A council member leaned forward. You created limits on your own authority? Yes. Why would anyone do that? Alexander looked at the records. Because a system that depends on one person is not strong. It is fragile. Veilira watched from her seat, noticing something important. Alexander was not trying to prove that he was harmless. He was acknowledging why people were afraid. That difference mattered. The discussion continued for hours. Economic dependence, technology transfer, political influence. Every possible risk was examined. The council did not question whether Alexander had good intentions. They questioned whether good intentions were enough. For the first time, Alexander understood that his greatest challenge was not convincing Eloria that he was trustworthy. It was proving that trust should never depend on a single individual. When the meeting ended, the council requested additional conditions. Full transparency of human corporate activity inside Elorian territories. Independent review boards. Limits on expansion into critical infrastructure. Alexander accepted every condition. That decision created a new conflict. Not with Eloria, with his own people. That evening, several human executives joined him through a private communication channel. These restrictions will reduce our market position, one said. Competitors will take advantage. Alexander looked at the financial projections. The numbers represented decades of work, thousands of employees, entire industries built around his decisions. You are right, he said. The executives became silent. Then why agree? Another asked. Alexander closed the report. Because if the only way to succeed is for everyone else to become dependent on us, then we built the wrong kind of success. Later, Veilira found him reviewing the final agreement alone. You knew this would cost you, she said. Alexander looked at the city beyond the window. Yes. And you still accepted it. He paused. A partnership that only works when one side keeps all the advantages is not a partnership. Veilira looked toward the lights of Eloria's capital. For centuries, her people had protected their civilization by controlling what entered their world. Now they faced a different challenge. Not whether they could stop change, whether they were wise enough to shape it. The archive beneath Eloria's capital was older than most civilizations in the galaxy. Its walls were built before modern communication networks, before interstellar trade routes, before Eloria became the political power it was known as today. For generations, future rulers had entered the archive to study the decisions of those who came before them. But Princess Veilira had always been taught to focus on the victories, the expansions, the treaties, the moments when Eloria stood above its rivals. She had rarely studied the failures. That changed when she brought Alexander Reed through the sealed entrance. The human billionaire stopped in front of the first historical record displayed inside the chamber. It was not a victory. It was a failed alliance. You preserve this? He asked. Veilira looked at the damaged record. Why would we remove it? Alexander studied the information. Most civilizations hide their mistakes. Most civilizations repeat them, she replied. The answer was immediate. Honest. Alexander looked at her for a moment before turning back to the archive. The records did not present Elorian leaders as perfect figures. They showed uncertainty, miscalculations, decisions made with incomplete information. They showed rulers who made errors and survived because they were willing to admit them. Your people understand something many civilizations forget, Alexander said. What? Veilira asked. A successful history is not a history without mistakes. It is a history that learns from them. She did not respond immediately. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of someone who had spent years surrounded by people afraid to question tradition. Deeper inside the archive rested an artifact from Iloria's first deep space expedition, a damaged navigation module recovered from a vessel that had nearly failed before returning home. Veilira activated the record beside it. The mission was considered a disappointment for many years. Alexander examined the damaged device. Why? They lost equipment. They changed their route. They returned later than expected. But they returned. Veilira looked at him. That was not how the event was remembered. Alexander touched the edge of the display. Then perhaps the problem was not the mission. Perhaps it was the way history judged it. For a brief moment, Veilira saw something unexpected. Alexander was not comparing Iloria to Earth. He was not trying to prove one civilization was better. He was simply looking for the lesson beneath the surface. Later, she showed him the private records of previous rulers. Not the official documents. The personal ones. The doubts they never shared publicly. The questions they wrote before making impossible decisions. One entry described a ruler who feared a choice would divide Iloria. Another described a leader who admitted that protecting tradition had become more important than protecting people. Alexander read the records quietly. You kept these hidden? He asked. No, Veilira said. We kept them safe. She looked toward the ancient writings. A ruler who believes they are always right becomes dangerous. The sentence stayed with him. That evening, Alexander returned to the joint development plans for the first human Ilorian infrastructure project. He removed several sections from his original proposal. Veilira noticed. Those were your most efficient solutions. Alexander nodded. For human environments. And now they have to work for Ilorian reality too. She studied the revised design. It was slower, more complicated, less profitable, but it gave both civilizations equal control. For the first time since arriving on Iloria, Alexander was not trying to bring a solution into another world. He was allowing another world to change the way he solved problems. And Veilira understood something important. She had not chosen a human because he could influence the galaxy. She had chosen him because he was willing to be influenced by it. The first joint project between human and Ilorian engineers was supposed to prove that two civilizations could build something greater together. Instead, it revealed how difficult true cooperation actually was. The project was an emergency medical network designed for outer settlements far from major trade routes. The goal was simple: deliver faster treatment, better diagnostics, and reliable support to colonies separated by enormous distances. The reality was far more complicated. Human technology had been built around flexibility. A system had to be repaired quickly, modified locally, and adapted to unexpected situations. Ilorian technology had been built around stability. Their systems were designed to operate for centuries with minimal failure. Both approaches had created successful civilizations. Neither could simply replace the other. Inside the Ceres Orbital Development Facility, Alexander Reed watched the compatibility report appear on the central display. The results were worse than expected. Human medical systems could not fully interpret Ilorian biological data. Ilorian diagnostic modules rejected several human emergency protocols. The network was functional, but not reliable enough for distant colonies where help could take hours or even days to arrive. One engineer pointed at the display. We can solve this by replacing the Ilorian components with human architecture. Alexander looked at the projected timeline. How long? 8 months. Another engineer added. Possibly longer if local regulations slow deployment. Alexander looked at the settlement map. 8 months was acceptable on paper. It was unacceptable to the people waiting. His first instinct was immediate. Build faster. Deploy faster. Control the variables. It was the same mindset that had built his companies. But as he studied the data, he noticed something he had ignored before. The problem was not that one system was better. The problem was that both sides had assumed the other should adapt first. Stop the replacement proposal, Alexander said. The engineers looked surprised. Veilira, standing near the observation window, noticed the hesitation in his voice. You have another solution? She asked. Alexander looked at the failed integration reports. I have a different understanding of the problem. He expanded the data. We treated compatibility like a technical issue. It is not. He paused. It is a trust issue. The room became silent. An Ilorian scientist stepped forward. Explain. Alexander adjusted the model. Human systems were designed to survive uncertainty. Ilorian systems were designed to prevent uncertainty. We built two different answers to the same fear. The revised design removed the idea of a single controlling system. Instead, it created separate medical modules connected through shared emergency protocols. Local colonies would maintain authority over their own operations. Human and Ilorian specialists would provide support without replacing local decision-making. It was slower, more expensive, less efficient. It was also something both civilizations could accept. Weeks followed with disagreements over every detail. Nothing moved quickly. Human engineers questioned Ilorian restrictions. Ilorian scientists questioned human assumptions about rapid deployment. Progress came through arguments, revisions, and uncomfortable compromises. Then the first field test failed. A remote settlement received the new equipment, but unexpected environmental conditions caused several biological scanners to produce incorrect readings. The failure was not catastrophic, but it exposed a weakness nobody had predicted. The old approach would have delayed the report until a solution existed. Alexander made a different choice. He released the failure data immediately. Within hours, critics across the galaxy used it as evidence that the Alliance was moving too quickly. Veilira found Alexander reviewing the public reactions alone. "You could have waited," she said. "Yes. Your reputation would have been protected." Alexander closed the report. The system would not have been. She looked at him quietly. This was the first time she saw the cost of his principles. Transparency did not guarantee approval. Responsibility did not guarantee success. But the next version of the network improved because the failure had been acknowledged instead of hidden. For the first time, both civilizations understood something neither could have learned alone. A perfect system built by one world would always have limits. A stronger future required two worlds willing to admit they did not have all the answers. The success of the revised medical network created a new challenge that no one had prepared for. It proved cooperation was possible. It also proved cooperation had consequences. Across Eloria, questions began appearing in government reports, public forums, and private discussions. If human technology became essential to outer settlements, would Eloria still control its own future? The concern was not about Alexander Reed's intentions. Even his critics admitted that he had acted with restraint. The concern was whether good intentions could prevent long-term dependence. Lord Kalen Voss presented the issue before the council with the same calm precision he had used since the beginning. He did not accuse. He analyzed. "The Alliance has created benefits," he said, displaying economic projections across the chamber. "Medical access has improved. Emergency response has improved. But we must examine what happens when the system becomes something we cannot operate without." The data showed a difficult reality. Several remote colonies had begun relying heavily on human-designed infrastructure. Not because anyone forced them to, because it was efficient, because it worked, because replacing it seemed unnecessary. Alexander stood among the observers and studied the information. Months earlier, he would have searched for the flaw in Kalen's argument. He would have looked for evidence proving the concern was exaggerated. Instead, he looked for the part that was true. Veilira noticed. "You agree with him," she said quietly after the session. Alexander watched supply vessels move above the capital through the observation window. "I agree that the risk exists." She turned toward him. "That is not what your executives will want to hear." He knew she was right. That evening, Alexander met with the leadership teams of his companies. The conversation was harder than any political negotiation. These were the people who had helped build his entire network. "The proposed changes will reduce expansion opportunities," one executive said. "Some markets may be lost permanently." Alexander looked at the financial reports projected in front of him. The numbers represented decades of work, thousands of employees, entire industries depending on his decisions. "Yes," he said. The executive paused. "And you are willing to accept that?" Alexander remained silent for a moment. Then he closed the report. "If protecting our position requires others to become dependent on us, then we created a weakness, not a success." The following day, Alexander presented a new framework to the council. Human corporations would no longer control critical alliance infrastructure alone. Ilorian institutions would receive full technical access. Independent multi-species committees would oversee essential systems. Expansion would continue only where local governments approved it. The response was immediate. Some human investors accused him of abandoning his own civilization's advantage. Some Elorian representatives argued the changes did not go far enough. The decision satisfied no one completely. That was how Veolyra knew it was probably closer to the truth. Later, she found Alexander in the archive chamber, standing before records of previous leaders who had faced similar choices. "You knew this would cost you," she said. Alexander nodded. "Yes. Then why continue?" He looked at the old records. "Because avoiding the cost does not remove the consequence." Veolyra studied him carefully. For the first time, she saw the burden behind his choices. Alexander was not sacrificing power because it was easy. He was sacrificing it because he believed power without limits eventually became someone else's problem. Outside the palace, many believed the human billionaire had weakened his own position. They were wrong. He had done something far more difficult. He had accepted that the future of two civilizations could not be built around one person's success. It had to be strong enough to continue even without him. The first major crisis after the reforms did not come from political opposition. It came from distance. A remote Elorian settlement beyond the outer navigation routes suddenly stopped transmitting medical updates, environmental reports, and navigation data. The colony was not destroyed. It was simply too far away from everyone who could help. In the center of the Joint Operations Facility, warning signals continued appearing across the main display. The problem was not the technology. The problem was time. Messages between distant systems still required hours to travel. Rescue vessels still needed days to arrive. No agreement between civilizations could change the laws of physics. Alexander Reed stood before the command table, studying incomplete information from the isolated colony. Population levels, medical reserves, environmental conditions. Every piece of data arrived separated by silence. Human rescue ships can reach them in 14 hours, an officer reported. But diverting those vessels will leave 3 other settlements without emergency coverage. Another analyst displayed the Elorian option. Local support ships can arrive faster, but their medical systems cannot access the current human design network. The room became quiet. There was no perfect choice, only different consequences. Alexander felt the familiar instinct return. Take control. Send every available resource. Remove uncertainty through action. That approach had built his companies. It had solved countless problems before. But this time, the situation was different. The people waiting for help were not another business challenge. They were a civilization deciding whether it could trust itself. "What can the colony do without us?" Alexander asked. Several engineers looked surprised. They expected him to ask what they could send. An Elorian specialist expanded the local systems report. Their emergency infrastructure is still operational. Limited, but functional. Alexander studied the data. Then why are we treating them as if they are powerless? No one answered immediately, because the assumption had been hidden inside the problem from the beginning. Veolyra stepped closer to the display. Elorian settlements were designed to survive isolation, she said. Human systems were designed to reduce isolation. She looked at Alexander. "We keep trying to decide which philosophy is better." Alexander nodded slowly. When the answer is probably that both were incomplete. Together, they created a new response plan. Instead of sending one massive rescue effort controlled from the center, they divided support across multiple locations. Local Elorian systems would maintain authority. Human teams would provide additional resources. Smaller vessels would move independently to avoid creating new vulnerabilities. It was slower, more complicated, but it allowed the colony to remain part of the solution. Hours passed. The entire galaxy seemed to wait with them. Then the first message arrived. The colony had stabilized its own medical systems. Additional support had reached them shortly afterward. No lives were lost. No civilization had saved the other. They had solved the problem together. Later that evening, Alexander stood alone in the observation room above the operations center. Veolyra joined him quietly. "You almost chose the old way," she said. Alexander looked at the distant stars. "Yes. Why didn't you?" He remained silent for a moment. "Because I realized something." She waited. Helping people does not mean making them dependent on you. Veolyra looked through the glass at the endless darkness between worlds. The lesson was larger than the crisis itself. For centuries, Eloria had protected independence by limiting outside influence. Humans had built progress by expanding connection. Neither approach was wrong. Both became dangerous when taken too far. The next day, the council received the full report. Lord Kalen Voss read it carefully. He found no evidence of human dominance. He found no evidence of Elorian isolation. He found something more difficult to create. A system where power was shared because neither side trusted itself enough to hold all of it alone. The final review of the Human-Elorian alliance began under the weight of every decision made before it. This was not a ceremony. It was not a celebration. It was an examination of whether two civilizations could continue forward after discovering how difficult cooperation truly was. The council chamber remained silent as Lord Kalen Voss presented the complete record of the reforms, the medical network, and the outer colony crisis. He did not stand as an opponent anymore. He stood as someone responsible for asking the questions others preferred to avoid. The alliance has succeeded, Kalen said. But success does not prove that every choice was correct. The display behind him showed areas where human technology had accelerated development, but also regions where dependence had increased. We cannot replace isolation with reliance. Both create weakness. Alexander Reed listened without interruption. That alone surprised many observers. The galaxy had expected the human billionaire to defend himself. Instead, he allowed the criticism to exist. Veilira noticed the difference. Years earlier, Alexander would have searched for the flaw in an argument before considering its value. Now he searched for the part that might be true. A council member turned toward him. Your companies created many of these systems. Without your involvement, this progress would have taken decades. Alexander nodded. That is possible. Then why should Eloria believe your influence will not continue expanding? Alexander looked around the chamber. You should not believe it because I promise restraint. He paused. You should believe it only if the system still works when I am no longer involved. The words changed the discussion. He activated the final proposal. The remaining human-controlled infrastructure would be transferred gradually to independent organizations. Elorian institutions would receive full technical access. Multi-species committees would oversee essential systems. No single government, company, or individual would hold enough control to dominate the alliance. Several council members reacted immediately. You are reducing your own influence, one said. Alexander answered calmly. Yes. And you accept that? If the alliance requires my influence to survive, then it was never stable. The room became quiet. But the most important reaction came from Lord Kalen. He studied the proposal carefully before speaking. You understand that some of my concerns were correct. Alexander looked at him. Yes. The answer surprised everyone. There was no argument, no attempt to win, only acknowledgement. And some of mine were incomplete, Kalen replied. That is also true. For the first time, the two men who represented different fears of the future stood on the same side of the same problem. Later, after the council session ended, Veilira remained inside the chamber. She looked at the empty seats of the leaders who had shaped Eloria for generations. Alexander approached quietly. You convinced them, she said. He shook his head. No, she looked at him. Then what happened? Alexander glanced at the records surrounding them. They convinced themselves after seeing the evidence. Veilira understood. That was the difference between influence and leadership. Real leadership did not force people to follow. It created a space where people could make the right decision themselves. The next day, the council announced the final agreement. The alliance would continue, but no civilization would stand above the others. No species would be protected from questions. No leader would be considered beyond accountability. Across the galaxy, observers searched for the moment when power had shifted. They expected a victory. Instead, history recorded something quieter. A human had entered another civilization carrying enormous influence. He gained their trust not by proving he was powerful enough to lead them. He gained it by proving he understood why no one should have unlimited power at all. The hardest decision Princess Veilira ever faced was not choosing a human. It was choosing what kind of ruler she wanted to become afterward. The announcement of the final reforms reached every corner of Eloria. Some citizens welcomed the changes. Others believed the princess had sacrificed too much for an uncertain future. The criticism was not unexpected. In fact, Veilira understood why it existed. A leader who only listened to approval was not leading. She was being protected from reality. Inside the Royal Assembly Hall, representatives from every major region of Eloria gathered for the final vote. Alexander Reed was present, but he did not stand beside her. He remained among the observers, exactly where he had chosen to stand from the beginning. This was not his decision to make. It was Eloria's. Veolyra looked across the chamber at generations of leaders who had protected their civilization through caution and control. She understood their fear because she had once shared it. The difference was that she had learned fear could protect a civilization from danger, but it could also prevent that civilization from growing. Many believe this alliance began because I selected an individual from another world, Veolyra said. Her voice carried through the chamber. They believe our future changed because of one human. She paused. They are wrong. The central display activated. It showed the medical network failures, the economic concerns, the disagreements, the moments where both civilizations had made mistakes. This future was not created by one person's influence. It was created by thousands of people willing to admit they did not have all the answers. Several representatives exchanged uncertain looks. Veolyra continued. Eloria has survived for centuries because we preserved what mattered. But preservation does not mean refusing change. It means understanding what deserves to continue. A council member stood. And if this decision weakens us? Veolyra looked directly at him. Then we will learn and adapt. And if we regret it, then we will correct our mistake. The answer surprised the chamber. Not because it was powerful, because it was honest. After the assembly ended, Lord Kalen Voss approached her privately. For years, he had represented caution. Some had called him an obstacle. Veolyra no longer saw him that way. You know some will still blame you, he said. She nodded. Yes, even if history proves you right. Veolyra looked toward the city beyond the palace. History is not written by people who are always right. It is written by people willing to accept the consequences of their choices. Kalen remained silent for a moment. Then he lowered his head slightly. Not as surrender, as respect. Later that evening, Veolyra joined Alexander on the observation deck, the same place where they had first discussed the burden of her decision. The stars stretched endlessly beyond them. You lost something today, she said. Alexander looked at her. So did you. He understood immediately. The reforms had reduced his corporate power. They had also changed the traditional authority of the throne. Neither of them had gained everything. That was the point. Do you regret it? Veolyra asked. Alexander looked toward the distant worlds connected by their new alliance. Ask me again when someone else is making decisions without needing me. She studied him. You actually want that? He nodded. A system that depends on one person is not a future. It is a delay. For the first time, Veolyra saw the final difference between power and responsibility. Power wanted to remain necessary. Responsibility wanted to become unnecessary. And as Eloria stepped into an uncertain future, the princess who once shocked the galaxy with her choice proved something far greater. She had not chosen a human to save her civilization. She had chosen a future where no single person had to save it at all. Years after the reforms, the galaxy stopped measuring the human-Elorian alliance by its beginnings. The questions had changed. People no longer asked whether a human and an alien princess could work together. They asked whether the system they created could survive without them. That was the question Alexander Reed cared about most. The answer came quietly, not through another ceremony, not through another political announcement. It appeared in places where no leaders were watching. On remote colonies where human engineers and Elorian specialists repaired systems together without asking which civilization created the original design. In research stations where decisions were made by teams instead of individuals. In schools where children studied the mistakes of history alongside its achievements. The alliance had not become successful because conflict disappeared. It became successful because conflict was no longer treated as failure. Alexander rarely appeared in public records anymore. The galaxy still remembered him as the human billionaire who had entered Elorian politics, but that description had become incomplete. His companies no longer controlled the systems that once gave him influence. Many investors considered that a mistake. Some believed he had abandoned the advantage that made him powerful. Alexander never argued with them. He had learned that people often judged decisions before they understood the reasons behind them. Years later, Princess Veolyra returned to the archive beneath the Elorian capital. The chamber remained unchanged. The same ancient walls, the same records of rulers who had faced impossible choices. But one new record had been added. It did not describe a human victory. It did not describe an Elorian transformation. It described a process. The failures, the disagreements, The moments where both civilizations had almost chosen the easier path. Veilira opened the record and watched the history unfold. Alexander entered the chamber a few moments later. He looked at the archive display and smiled slightly. You included everything. Veilira turned toward him. Everything important, including the mistakes? Especially those. She touched the record panel. Future generations do not need stories about perfect leaders. They need examples of people who corrected themselves. Alexander looked at the information surrounding them. That was never how history was usually written. Then perhaps history needed to change too. They stood together in silence, surrounded by the decisions that had shaped two civilizations. Years earlier, the galaxy had focused on one moment. A princess choosing a human. A billionaire standing beside a throne. A political decision that shocked worlds. But that was never the true story. Veilira had not changed Aloria because she chose Alexander. Alexander had not changed the galaxy because he was human. The transformation came from something more difficult. Both of them had accepted limits. Both had admitted mistakes. Both had allowed another civilization to challenge what they believed. Outside the archive, a group of students passed through the palace during a history lesson. Among them were human children and Elorian children studying the same events from different perspectives. One student raised a hand. Who was responsible for changing the galaxy? The teacher looked at the class for a moment before answering. Everyone who chose to listen when it would have been easier to ignore. The students continued walking, discussing the lesson among themselves, not as representatives of separate worlds, simply as people curious about the future they would inherit. Veilira watched them disappear down the corridor. The stars beyond the palace windows remained the same as they had always been. Endless, distant, unreachable. But the civilizations beneath them had changed. Not because one species defeated another. Not because one person gained unlimited influence. They changed because two worlds discovered that the strongest future was not built by those who held the most power. It was built by those brave enough to share it. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this journey across the stars. We hope this story brought you inspiration and emotion. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to Galactic Contact for more unforgettable sci-fi stories waiting to be discovered.